Sorry about that. Is that better? Yeah. Good.
Okay. So
Janet, can you hear me okay? Perfect. Thank you. I was just saying while I was muted, I wanted to thank the not just Professor Miller for hosting me, Phi Beta Kappa at Williams College, but also for the intrepid folks who made it here in the snow today. It is an extraordinary blizzard happening outside, so much appreciated, folks who trekked through the snow to get here. It's great to be back. I've been a member of the Phi Beta Kappa chapter here at Williams for exactly 40 years. I was elected to follow my senior year. I'm class of '84. I'd actually wanted to wear my key today. I invested in this thing and haven't got a whole lot of use out of it. And somehow I managed to leave it back in Oxford. However, in what I hope was a good omen, I chanced upon this key at a flea market in New York City. Per the inscription, it belonged to a fellow called Oscar Erlandson. He was Princeton class of 29, and this guy was a remarkable person. He was one of the first people hired by Grumman Aircraft in 1930. He's employee badge number 47, and he rose to become Grumman's chief designer. His last project was the lunar module that ferried Messrs. Aldrin and Armstrong and Collins to the surface of the moon. Every Phi Beta Kappa key has an image on it, and it's an outstretched hand pointing to the stars. So Mr. Erlandson, obviously a very literal guy, but also a great example of the high standards people in this society set for themselves. I'm hoping that perhaps Phi Beta Kappa will help me get this key back to the Erlandson family someday very soon. In the tradition of Mr. Erlandson and Grumman, at least in spirit anyway, my own organization, the Institute for Digital Archaeology, or the IDA, is about to launch its own space program. It's on a much smaller scale, both figuratively and literally. And I'll say a little more about that later. Let me start by quickly introducing the IDA. We're an academic consortium in Oxford with a long and deep connection to the university there. We're perhaps best known for our reconstruction of Palmyra's Triumphal Arch, destroyed by ISIS in 2015. That project, it grew entirely accidentally out of an op-ed piece that I had written for the Times about possible responses to ISIS destruction of heritage assets throughout the Middle East. And over the course of a late August afternoon, this 300-word letter to the editor grew into a 3,000-word front-page cover story. It was the lead item the following day on the BBC World Service. It was picked up by just about every major newspaper in the world in dozens of languages. It made it to the cover of Newsweek. The idea that the destruction wrought by ISIS and their sledgehammers and their dynamite could be reversed in a matter of weeks. It somehow captivated people's imagination. It was an optimistic response, I think, and empathetic communities everywhere really responded. It didn't hurt that we had these incredibly adorable robots helping us with the project. In fact, I think I've got an image of the robots here somewhere. Let's see here. I can't seem to advance the slides.
do I have to click on it again?
Yes.
There we go. Okay. All right. Yes. And so there's one of our robots working on on one of these objects. So having told the world that I was going to rebuild Palmyra's iconic arch, suddenly I had to do it. At least I had the foresight to say that it might take a couple of months. So we bought ourselves a little time. But how my incredible partner, Oxford's Dr. Alexei Karanovska, secured 30 tons of Egyptian marble, trucked it overland through a hostile country to our workshop in Carrera, and then, having created this superb 3D model of the arch from tens of thousands of crowdsourced images, convinced our friends at Tor Art to carve a 2-story duplicate of Palmyra's most famous landmark, shipped it to England, and erected it on Trafalgar Square, all within 56 days. Are things that I guess at this point I have no special desire to tell in detail. The point is this: we did it, and the world came to watch. When my old Oxford classmate Boris Johnson and I stepped out onto Trafalgar Square, it was under the watchful gaze of 231 credentialed media sources, more than 600 journalists from CNN to TASS. It's a total that Boris later assured me that he would never again match in public office. The lesson here is be careful what you promise to do in print. But the media interest wouldn't have mattered very much if it didn't create positive social change. And shortly after our arch rose on Trafalgar Square, Mr. Johnson, having become UK Foreign Secretary, courageously advocated for sanctions against Russia for its role in the Syria conflict. And I'll note here that that most people in the West, including Boris's U.S. counterpart John Kerry, urged restraint. And we know, of course, in the fullness of time, who was proved right on that front. Within months, the reconstructed arch had drawn praise and support from governments around the world. Let me see here. I think I have there's Boris under the arch, looking pretty sharp. His hair is as messed up as ever. And then here we are under the arch here. Christine Lagarde, the IMF, Irina Bokova, the Director General of UNESCO, 3 Middle Eastern regional leaders. It was simply weeks and weeks and weeks of time, but that's all. And suddenly you get the heads of the UNESCO, head of the IMF, regional leaders, all pledging funding for Syria reconstruction, and they all came through in the end. Then in early 2017, the Arch was invited to stand at the G7 in Florence. We addressed the gathered ministers there alongside UNESCO, advocating for support for the general concept of reconstruction of heritage objects destroyed in conflict zones and natural disaster. And it marked a major shift of policy for UNESCO. Just months earlier, during a very memorable meeting in Irina Bokova's office in Paris, UNESCO had explained that they were fundamentally opposed to the idea of reconstruction. And not long after the G7 gathering and our joint presentation, the UN hosted our arch at the Place des Nations in Geneva and showed its support in every possible way for the project and for Syria as well, and for the concept of reconstruction in the context of conflict zones generally. A few months after that, I spoke at the United Nations General Assembly Hall alongside the presidents of both the Security Council and the General Assembly. And within a month of that appearance, the General Assembly passed Resolution 72-191, the most sweeping condemnation of the Assad regime ever adopted by that body to this day. The resolutions condemned the continued widespread and systematic gross violations of human rights and of international humanitarian law. And the vote was very lopsided, about 122 to 13, I think. Notably, in light of the subsequent events, the resolution was sponsored by the USA and Ukraine. So a different time, but the seeds were there. While this was the result, the UN's resolution of the work of many people, the massive media focus on the Arch unquestionably expanded awareness of suffering in Syria. A few weeks later, the New York Times named the Arch alongside Christo's Floating Islands as the public artwork of the year. The following year, we were invited by the House Foreign Affairs Committee to install the Arch outside the US Capitol, again during General Assembly Week. And significantly, the invitation came from both the Republican chair, Ed Royce, and the Democratic ranking member, Eliot Engel. The two men spoke, I have to say, beautifully under the Arch on the National Mall, pledging support for Syria. Less than a month after that, and despite an atmosphere you cannot even imagine, or I guess you can, of extreme partisanship, the issue then was the confirmation hearings of Justice Kavanaugh. But in that atmosphere, Congress approved on a voice vote a sweeping Syria bill called the Caesar's Syria Civilian Protection Act. It was co-sponsored by Royce and Engel, and it was an astonishing, at least in that moment, example of bipartisan cooperation that is today almost unimaginable. Among other things, the bill declared it is the policy of the United States that all diplomatic and coercive economic means should be used to compel the government of Bashar al-Assad to halt immediately the wholesale slaughter of the Syrian people and to support an immediate transition to a democratic government in Syria. That same month, Congress passed, again on a voice vote, the Iraq and Syria Genocide Relief and Accountability Act, a bill which contained financial provisions for providing the relief in Syria for genocide victims and for persecuted ethnic and minority groups. In the wake of that legislation, Mr. Engel didn't stop there. Engel eventually became the chairman when Congress changed hands, and he lobbied for the Trump administration and got it, significantly increased funding for both the State Department and USAID relief efforts in Syria. and saying the fight against Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State is not over, and he wanted, quote, the highest possible funding. And as of last year, under those provisions, $16 billion have been appropriated for food aid, medical supplies, emergency healthcare materials, shelter, clean water, you name it, for millions and millions of people across Syria. Now, 5 years have passed. And in part because of the success of the Palmyra Arch project, reconstruction has become a ubiquitous and respected tool for community rehabilitation in the aftermath of either violence or natural disaster. UNESCO has sponsored a huge number of projects around the world along these lines. The Mosul project, a good example, just completed, which was done in collaboration with our partners in Dubai in the Palmyra Arch project. And it's a great example of the potentialities for these kinds of efforts when they're executed thoughtfully, as the UN has, to improve the lives of local stakeholders, and the impact on livelihoods in Mosul in the tens of millions of dollars. At the IDA, the Arch project gave way to a number of other high-profile reconstructions, including the statue of Al-Lat, which was an iconic figure in the Syrian pantheon, also destroyed by ISIS. And we displayed that at the UN General Assembly Hall as well, under the auspices of the Italian Permanent Mission. We also, with the help of the late Queen Elizabeth, she gave us a couple of dozen trees, oak trees, ancient oak trees from Windsor Great Park, reconstructed the Sutton Hoo ship, this extraordinary vessel. Anyone who's read Beowulf knows what I'm talking about. If you've been to the British Museum, you've seen it. Also, the Herculaneum scrolls charred by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius when it blew its stack in 79 AD. And just most recently, this extraordinary Torgiano terracotta sculpture in Westminster Cathedral. Torgiano was the guy who broke Michelangelo's nose, had to flee Italy, went to England, and created some astonishing artworks there. And we're working on the reconstruction of this Torgiano altarpiece. So with the benefit of these experiences, our skill set seemed perfectly suited to the challenge of doing something about Britain's 200-year-old dispute with Greece over the possession of the Elgin marbles, a collection of about 132 statues and friezes chiseled from the facade of the Parthenon by Lord Elgin between sort of 1804 and 1812 or 1813. To the Greeks, you have to understand the Elgin marbles are a family heirloom, the stolen family heirloom. It's their crown jewels or their Statue of Liberty, and their removal under these circumstances and their subsequent retention by the British is a stain on their national pride. And obtaining their return has been one of the holy grails for successive Greek governments since the creation of the Hellenic state, really, in 1822. The British, however, have not been keen to let these things go for reasons that I'll explore in a couple of seconds. We thought, look, if two people want the same cake, an obvious possibility is to bake a second cake, and we knew just the robots for the job. And it was against this backdrop that the Greek ambassador, Ambassador Raptakis, a wonderful guy, and appeared together. There's Ambassador Raptakis at Keats House almost exactly a year ago, January 28th of last year. We have Poet Laureate Simon Armitage was there. It was a celebration of the Grecian urn and Keats' famous poem. We were marking the 200th anniversary of the death of John Keats. And after some not so much discussion, you have to understand the Greeks are primed for this already. Ambassador Raptakis and I announced our plan to reconstruct the Parthenon sculptures. That is to say, the Elgin marbles, the sculptures that are currently in the British Museum, we would create exact duplicates using the same rare Pentelic marble as the originals with a degree of accuracy that exceeds human visual acuity. So that these are perfect visual duplicates. And we propose beginning with two proof of concept objects, the famous Selene horse and a metope depicting the Centauromache. And for whatever reason, zeitgeist or otherwise, just like with the Arch, the media response was truly extraordinary. The day after we announced our plan, the Telegraph ran a piece. It's one of Britain's three leading national dailies, a long, favorable piece about the project. And the story immediately got picked up by all of the other UK national dailies and virtually every print, radio, and TV media source in Greece. We attended long strategy sessions at the Greek embassy with some great Greek food and some great conversation. And then on Valentine's Day of last year, February 14th, the Times, after 200 years of opposition, of staunch opposition to repatriation of the Elgin marbles, ran a full-page story on page 3 about our project, great photos, but more important than that, they ran a 500-word lead editorial in their editorial section, strongly endorsing our reconstruction project as a likely and reasonable solution to the Elgin dispute. And the Times was at pains to point out how these very special copies would allow the British Museum to fully discharge its public function, that is, to teach people about the art of ancient Greece, but also at the same time allow Britain to do the right thing and send these statues home. The Guardian immediately followed suit, the other main UK paper, and the story went viral and appeared in stories all around the world. In early July, the New York Times ran a full page, the front of the Science Times, the back page of the Science Times, 2,000 words on the story. The Washington Post followed suit. BBC World Service, TV networks here and there, that is to say the UK and the US, ran stories. So it became this media juggernaut, which helped keep it top of mind and helped to ensure that the public debate around the Elgin marbles continued with a degree of purpose and intensity that they had never seen before. And again, as with the Arch project, all of this media attention would have meant essentially nothing had it not resulted in some positive real-world impacts. Our proposal was favorably debated in the House of Lords almost immediately. Poll numbers swung wildly on the back of these discussions. Suddenly, 80% of Britons were favoring repatriation, and this is after centuries of stalemate. The Greeks and the British agreed to talks, and then just a few months later, the British Museum's relatively new chairman, former UK Chancellor, fellow Oxonian, George Osborne, dramatically announced there is a deal to be done. You have to understand, 200 years of deadlock. Those are the words the Greeks have been hoping to hear for centuries. Throughout the summer and the fall, momentum continued to build, again, in part because of the regular pace at which these stories appeared about our project and the work of others as well. And then events in the fall slowed things down a little bit. Of course, the UK has had 3 prime ministers over the last year. Queen Elizabeth passed away. The Greek PM has had some troubles, but nonetheless, things marched on. We came up with a novel legal concept for speeding things up. We found provisions in the British Museum Act of 1963, which allow, we believe, and apparently the Charities Commission in the UK believes as well, would allow the British Museum to act unilaterally in returning these things, which had been a matter of hot dispute. Many have alleged that an act of parliament would have been required, which of course would have taken additional time. I think we've clarified that point now. And then finally in November, so just a few months ago, the former head of the National Trust and the editor-in-chief of the Times, a few more articles about this, Simon Jenkins on the left, former head of the National Trust, editor of the Times, and I unveiled our first Pentelic reconstruction, the Elgin, of one of the Elgin marbles, that is the Selene horse. And like our initial project announcement, the event was heavily covered by the press. Again, all the UK national dailies, BBC, ITV, Euronews, Reuters, AP, Times Radio, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was front page news in every major newspaper in Greece. And best of all, the reviews were uniformly positive. Our reconstruction had absolutely nailed the original. It was a perfect copy. The very day after the unveiling of our copy, Mr. Osborne, the chair of the BM, made his strongest statement to that point in support of repatriation. He announced some of the BM's greatest objects, Mr. Osborne declared, could soon be seen again in the communities from which they came. If Greece is ready to find common ground, then so are we. I mean, it doesn't get much more clear than that. And finally, last month, almost exactly a year to the day after the Times published its editorial endorsing our plan, Mr. Osborne announced a tentative deal for the return of the Elgin marbles, an arrangement that he described as a cultural partnership that would, in his words, permit the marbles to be seen both in London and in Athens. So incredibly optimistic now that a deal is at hand. All that remains, I think, at this stage is for the parties to select the perfect moment for this to happen. The Greek elections are scheduled for next month, and so the hope is that once those are out of the way, repatriation will happen very quickly. Given the duration and the complexity of this struggle, lots of folks, especially here in the US, ask why the Elgin marbles have been such a sticking point between these two countries, NATO allies, longtime friends. I mean, King Charles is the great-grandson of King George I of Greece. I mean, these countries are practically joined in the hip. And on top of that, I don't think there's any cultural artifact in the Metropolitan Museum, the repatriation of which would occasion any particular excitement or emotion among most Americans. In fact, the Metropolitan has been repatriating significant objects for several years now, including several Benin bronzes, and has attracted very little domestic attention here outside of museum circles anyway. And the answer to the question of why the British mindset in this regard is so different than ours is not only interesting for what it says about the culture of the UK, but I think it's also interesting for what it has to say about why our public engagement projects have appealed so strongly to people's imaginations. Okay, so what's behind Britain's, I'll call it a fatal attraction to the marbles? Through the extravagance of its and people see this every day, through the extravagance of the UK's public ceremonies, its focus on aristocratic titles, its other indicia of pedigree and peerage, and perhaps, I guess, most publicly of all, its emphasis on the hereditary monarchy. We're coming up on a big coronation ceremony. Britain works very hard to project an image of long history, deep-rooted heritage. And in point of fact, Britain, at least in terms of it being a legal entity, is actually about 25 years younger than America. The Act of Union, which created the United Kingdom, was passed in 1800, the same year, coincidentally or not, that Elgin arrived in Athens and hatched his plan to bring the marbles over to England. The UK also acquired its national flag in that year, the Union Jack. So it's a generation younger than the Stars and Stripes. But England's newness goes beyond legal constructs like the Act of Union or the flag. England did not even acquire the pretense of a national identity. Nobody was saying the word England until Athelstan became King of England in the 10th century and declared himself as such. And until that time, you understand, the island was a home to warring factions of self-governing tribes. There were Danes, there were Celts, there were Picts, there were Saxons, and each one had its own heritage, each one had its own customs, and each one had its own history. And to confuse matters even further, 60 or 70 years after Athelstan came along, suddenly it's the Roman conquest, and that scrambled things up again. So compared to its continental peers, England was and is the New World. I mean, America really is just the newer world. But compared to Italy, France, its European peers, it is a new world. And even more significant, I guess, than the objective sense of newness around these legal definitions of what constitutes being a nation state. There was a comparatively slow development of culture in the UK, at least as compared to the great civilizations of the ancient world. I mean, think about it for a second. When Phidias was carving the Elgin marbles, Britain was still in its Neolithic period. When the amazing temples and palaces of ancient Athens were erected, Britons were primarily living in rustic earthworks. A native literary tradition, I mean, think about Beowulf, did not arise in Britain until much before the 8th century. It's 2,000 years after Aeschylus wrote the Oresteia. So by 1800, Britain had established itself as a dominant, I guess, the dominant global economic and military power. It stood at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution that was starting to unfold. The country had a new name, it had a new flag, and not unlike Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, who had a generation earlier and an ocean away looked to ancient Greece for sort of cultural pedigree, early 19th century British elites did exactly the same thing and decided that ancient Greece would be a great way to backfill, at least culturally, their shiny new enterprise, Great Britain. It gave it a backstory. And creating a strong link to the aesthetic and to the intellectual traditions of Greece provided England with all the provenance and prestige that it needed for the idea of building a sense of nation state. And so within a few short years, that is to say, by the first decades of the 1800s, Greek style had pervaded the Union Jack. There's Athelstan, and by the 1830s, Greek style had pervaded every aspect of British life. Everything from, I don't know, Wedgwood plates to Chippendale furniture, from ladies' hats that folks were buying at Liberty's to King George's crown. From the Pall Mall clubs to the Houses of Parliament, suddenly Greek style, Greek iconography was everywhere. And the ease with which Hellenic culture, represented by the Elgin marbles, was absorbed by Britons was due at least in part to the literal ethnic cleansing that these sculptures endured. Rigors that included acid washes, steel brushes. The BM curators were well aware that the marbles originally had been brightly painted, really garishly painted. And in fact, they had commissioned a study to confirm the presence of surface color in the first years of the 1800s. But anything other than pure white skin tones would have undermined the conceit that of cultural community, I guess you would say, the possession of the marbles provided. And so they were displayed in this form, in this stark white form. As an anthropologist that I know wrote, the absence of color allowed for the blurring, even erasure of ethnicity, making it easier for Britons to project themselves onto the marbles. The ruddy browns and reds that Phidias used to depict great Greek male skin would have diminished the possibility for largely white Britons personal engagement with the sculptures. To Elgin's native contemporaries, the lack of color allowed the figures to seem claimable. In short, through their whitewashed appearance, the marbles were primed for absorption into the British national narrative. It was a prepackaged foundational myth that could be and was slotted into this inconvenient and embarrassing at some level historical void. And aiding this process of assimilation is the fact that the marbles, at least in their current battered state, are little more than fragments. If you've been to the British Museum, you've seen these things arrayed on the floor of the Duveen Gallery, and it's bits and pieces, broken fingers, broken legs, missing noses, decontextualized from the building on which they originally were affixed. And the idea of the fragment, I think, is interesting and important here. Freud had a lot to say about the unique mutability of fragments in his discussion of fetishes in Totem and Taboo, right? The shoe fetish. Fetishism, he said, is pleasure in fragments. The point of the fetish, he said, is that it offers up the potential for what Freud called hidden histories. It is about the search for something that is missing, and through that, an opportunity for reconstituting lost moments of perfect happiness. He couldn't have summed up Britain's reaction to the appearance of the marbles in London any better. The hidden histories that they discovered within these objects provided them with this perfect template for British culture that would survive for 2 centuries. So much so, and do I have a picture of this? Yes, there he is. So much so that when Boris Johnson, my dear friend and now my next door neighbor in Morton Marsh in the UK, when he was departing office as prime minister in 2023, so just a few months ago, he likened himself to Cincinnatus. I mean, it wasn't Churchill. It was Cincinnatus that he channeled on his way out the door in 10 Downing Street. It shows you the extent to which this is deeply ingrained, at least in a certain element of British society, this direct sense of connection to Greek antiquity. It's worth noting that the fragmentation that defines the fetish is as much with us now as it ever was. And I think this helps people sort of put it in perspective. And I would argue that because of digital life, it's probably even more true today. I read recently in one of the art magazines, a critic that I like said, today the clip is preferred to the film, the aesthetic fragment is preferred to the whole. The ubiquity of TikTok testifies to the power of this impulse. It encourages a personal attachment to fragments, moments, gestures, rather than a collective way of looking. And in so doing, it confers a significant narrative authority to the viewer. And that's exactly the same authority wielded by these English cultural reformers 200 years ago. The same critic said, fragmented consumption of art objects gives the viewer control over the spectacle. And this was exactly right. This was exactly it. And it explains to a large degree the sense of effrontery, I think, that the Greeks feel, because they understand what's going on here. It wasn't simply stealing the objects, it was pirating the culture and that sense of control, narrative control over the story that those objects tell, and the extent to which that story was co-opted to tell the story of a country 1,200 miles to the north that had no geographical, historical, or other affinities with the homeland of these Parthenon sculptures. And so, to sort of sum it up, whether through this unconscious psychology of storytelling and the sleight of hand the fetish allows, British elites successfully recast these Elgin marbles as essentially, I don't know, pre-national objects, presenting ancient Athens as some kind of mythologized lost utopia, disconnected from the modern Greek state completely. They are purveyed simultaneously as belonging to everybody, but at the same time to nobody in particular. And for 200 years, this has been the organizational position of the British Museum, and it's been a cornerstone, as that picture of Mr. Johnson attests, a cornerstone of Britain's national identity. However, everything eventually comes to an end. And the zeitgeist around cultural piracy has changed dramatically in recent years. Part of it's the war in Ukraine. Part of it's a sense of ownership around cultural constructs in general. And it's also because the legal landscape has changed considerably around looted objects, with the result that museums everywhere are sending pilfered treasures home. And if Mr. Osborne has his way, the British Museum will soon follow suit. And we're already looking forward, I have to tell you, to the big party in Athens, which we hope will happen as soon as May. But history, as always, teaches important lessons. And this incredibly strange story of the Elgin marbles, really unique around the world, has forced us to think at the IDA deeply about how people form relationships with heritage assets. And although the outward focus is invariably on the object itself, its provenance, its physical characteristics, the reality is that creating a relationship with a monument, really with, I guess, any artwork, is a highly personal process of projection. The meaning that you have in experiencing the experience you have in the presence of heritage objects, it comes from inside of you. It's not special magical rays that are being projected by the object itself. It's absorbed from without, not from. It's not absorbed from without. It comes from within. And to turn back to Freud for a second. He explored this phenomenon throughout his life under the rubric of what he called object relation theory. He concluded that an evocative object is one that, he says, resonates with personal and cultural significance, producing chains of association, inciting emotional responses, and impelling imaginative activity. So take this concept a little bit further. The fact is, we form these strong embodied connections to objects like this, objects that we encounter in important places, in communities, and places around the world, these heritage sites, and we enter into relationships with them that allow us to express personal idioms that are important to us. And in doing so, we make a shared use of these cultural resources, shared throughout the community. And this highly personal conception of object assimilation, whether it's monuments or whether it's artworks, aligns absolutely with my own experience, and particularly my experience around our public engagement efforts at the IDA. My relationship with our reconstructed Arch of Palmyra is derived almost exclusively from these strong personal associations that I developed in little moments here and there over the course of our work in that area. Without question, for me, the most memorable installation, the Arch stood in Dubai, it stood in New York City, it stood in Washington, D.C., it stood in London, in Geneva, all around the world. But for me, the installation that I'll never forget was one that we did in Arona, Italy, on the banks of Lake Maggiore. We were joined at the unveiling by the two sons of Khaled al-Assad. Dr. al-Assad was the chief archaeologist in Palmyra. He was murdered by ISIS for refusing to disclose the location of the city's hidden treasures, and his body was placed on public display by ISIS, by the terrorists, to send a message. And it was in significant part on behalf of his two sons that we undertook the Arch project in the first place. And whenever I look at the Arch, I see it through the lens of that night and through the lens of those two men. So, and I have to say, it was by no means the case that I was the only one who came to feel this way about the Arch. And in fact, wherever we went, from Dubai to New York City, visitors were always at pains to tell us what the Arch meant to them. It was an important thing that they felt they needed to do, to seek us out and explain why the Arch was important to them. And I always remember that on the night of the Trafalgar Square installation, that very first installation, we wandered over to the Arch. It was after midnight, to see who might be there. And we found a group of young Syrians standing under the Arch, and we spoke with them briefly. They had come from Paris by car to see the installation that had been so much covered by the world press. And they couldn't believe that the obscure but iconic architecture of their beleaguered country, sadly still beleaguered today, was being celebrated in such a conspicuous spot and in such a conspicuous way. And one of the young women told me that she had grown up just a few miles from Palmyra, but had somehow, whether it was school field trips or whatever, had managed never to see this famous this famous artifact when it still stood in Palmyra. And here she had traveled 13 hours by car to see the reconstruction. So I asked her, why? And she told me that our arch, representing as it did, I guess, in her eyes, friendship and empathy of people who had no direct connection to her, people far away that she had never met and would never get to know personally, and had no direct connection to Syria, had done this for her and for her country, that it meant infinitely more to her than any Roman arch ever could. And she said to her, this reconstructed arch was a powerful monument in its own right. And that was a message that we heard over and over again. So anybody that ever doubts the power of a copy to embody something more than just, I don't know, what it purports to replicate, needs to rethink it, in my opinion. It's an amazing process, and it's one that we were really privileged, I think, to witness firsthand. And the story, these stories and these moments always recall for me the words of this fellow, Johann Winkelmann. And he's the man who did more than anyone in Regency England to popularize Greek culture. You got to understand, the 18th century Greek culture it was too sexy. There was too much nudity. It was too debauched. It was not appealing to Englishmen. Suddenly, Winkelmann comes along. He recharacterizes it with a sense of asceticism. He emphasizes the athletic dimension, emphasizes the literature, the philosophy, and suddenly Greek culture becomes very interesting to folks in the UK. And he really, I would suggest, is more firmly at the root of the Elgin dispute than just about anyone. But he set up copies, quite interestingly. What is imitated, if handled with reason, may assume another nature and become one's own. And that's exactly right. And that's certainly been our experience of treasured monuments wherever we have gone. And on the subject of going places, and I promised I'd come back to this at the very end here, and with a fond tip of the hat to Mr. Erlandson, wherever he is, in his contributions to Apollo 11, the IDA is poised to enter into a space race of its own. Let's see what we have here. Oh, here we have the arch in Arona, and there are the two sons of Professor al-Assad, one in a wheelchair himself, shot by ISIS terrorists. Here are the folks, those young folks from Syria who made their way from Paris to London on that night when everything got started. There's Winkelmann, who I guess started all the trouble, at least as far as the Greeks are concerned. But here is an interesting photograph, and it's intentionally obscure. This is the very first public viewing of this object. But the IDA is poised now to enter into a space race of its own. We fabricated tiny copies of the Selene horse that measure from nose to ear a little less than the diameter of human hair. The features of these minuscule horses are smaller than the smallest wavelength of visible light, meaning that they can't be seen with any optical system. A scanning electron microscope is required to view them. However, these microscopic repositories of cultural heritage, I think the smallest sculptures perhaps ever produced, contain every bit as much detail as the original, and they will in time form part of the IDA's Space Museum. It's a collection of more than 100 miniaturized icons of human artistic achievement that will travel beyond our solar system and bring the best of our race to whatever audiences might be found in deep space, with a projected launch date of October 2024. So stay tuned. I'll end now with a quote from one of my favorite books, a book that I first encountered here at Williams College many years ago in one of Anita Sikulski's English classes. Tristropique, the great classic by Claude Lévi-Strauss, no longer read, I don't think, very much. Too bad. But this quote from Lévi-Strauss actually sums up perfectly everything that I do not believe about cultural heritage. And so, as is often the case with dialectic, it shares the twin virtues of being infinitely illustrative while at the same time being infinitely concise. And here's what Lévi-Strauss said in my very poor translation. Objects are what matter. Only they carry the evidence that throughout the centuries, something really happened among human beings. I mean, first of all, what an incredibly strange thing for a structuralist to say. But leaving that aside, I would suggest it's just the opposite. People are all that matter. Whatever value monuments hold for people comes without question from within them. And as the disputes around heritage assets soldier on, we would all, I think, do well to remember this. Thanks again to my host here at Williams, to Professor Miller, to Phi Beta Kappa, to the Greek Embassy in London for their extraordinary advice and support, to our Italian fabrication partners, Torart, to our very dear friends at the Freud Museum, where our Celine horse still sits today. Go and visit it if you're in London. And thanks especially to my partner, Dr. Alexei Karanovska, without whom all of this would have been completely impossible. So thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you soon.
From the audience and unmute the people.
I'll unmute you. You were. Any questions, please feel free to ask.
Why don't you stay up here and
Yeah, sure.
this way you
Thank
can.
you so much for wonderful talk. I wanted to ask you, just to think about this arch issue, and this is my poor knowledge of the history. Roughly around when in the history of the Roman Empire, when was it built? Of course, it was in Palmyra, but was it like, I imagine, first century?
So good fix. Yeah, so it's quite late. It's a little bit later than that. And there are two famous arches in Palmyra. So there's always confusion about this. There's the famous, even larger arch part of the colonnade in Palmyra, the so-called Arch of Baal, which had religious associations, religious resonances, and then there was the Arch of Palmyra that we reconstructed, which was actually almost certainly a secular structure, a part of the marketplace. In the center of Palmyra, historically, weddings would take place under the arch. So the interesting thing about it, because of the fact that it was built so late, the artistic styles embodied by the arch are incredibly varied. It really is this amazing mishmash and of course it's you know where Palmyra is. It's right in the midst of the Silk Road, so people are coming back and forth there all the time, bringing with them artistic ideas, cultural ideas that become embodied in the art and architecture of Palmyra, and certainly that was the case with the arch. So as an art historical object, it actually is fascinating, both for its sort of anthropological associations, what it meant culturally to the people of Palmyra, but also what it embodies more broadly about the artistic traditions of that time period. And it's a visible proof of the migration of artistic styles that came along the Spice Road, along with everything else of it. I mean, the Spice Road is the greatest misnomer of all time. It was technology, it was philosophy, it was science, it was everything. The spice was the least of it. But anyway,
Thank you.
sure.
So,
Recording in progress.
so we have a question from the audience. Okay.
So I'll just ask you a question. If you just,
Sure.
please talk about who designed the robots.
So the robots are absolutely extraordinary, designed by our partners in Carrera. The company's name is Torart, Torart. They have a great website. They have now formed a second entity called Robotor, robot with OR at the end. And if you go to Carrera, the city is littered with enterprises that purport to make carved reconstructions of things. You provide them with the model, they'll provide you with the new carved object. As is the case with lots of different kinds of technology, it exists in many different forms. Torart and Robotor really stand alone at the absolute top of the heap. And it's a function both of the hardware and the software. The fellow who runs it is an absolute wizard when it comes to this, and the level of craftsmanship, resolution, et cetera, that they're able to achieve is clearly, and you see it immediately, a cut above everything else that exists. I mean, to give you an idea, Damien Hirst, Jeff Koons, all of the great sculptors around the world who work in marble, all of their work is done at Torart. Cheek by Jowl with our Celine horse were these amazing creations from Jeff Koons. They haven't yet been displayed publicly, so I won't do much to describe them. I will say that when you have the opportunity in New York or in London, once they are, you have to, probably the most beautiful marble carvings I've ever seen, but they were carved by the same robots in Carrera. And I say carved by the robots, and I'll just say something quickly about that. Much of the story has been the story of John Henry versus the steam engine. People, I think, have become fascinated because these art objects exquisitely beautiful, carved by machines. And what does that say about where humanity stands in relation to technology? But the truth is that seldom gets reported is that, and I always tell people the story, but it just doesn't find its way into print for whatever reason, is that the robots carve 95% of these sculptures. The last 5% is done by human beings, and they have extraordinary artists and craftsmen in the Tour Art facility, just steps away from where Michelangelo had his studio in Carrara, and the quality of their work is what really brings these things to life. And it's a great, I think, it's a relief to people who want to believe there's something about art that needs to be human. And I have to say, it is that kind of difference that you see in what the robot produces versus what the humans produce. There is something that is alive and vital about the finished product once the human beings have had to go at it versus what the machine does. And I'll also say this finally, which is that Phidias himself absolutely would have used this technology if he had access to it. Phidias was known to be an early and eager adopter of whatever technology was available to produce as much sculpture as he could produce, because this guy was building things literally by the ton. I mean, when you're called upon to decorate a building the scale of the Parthenon, if someone said to you, "Hey, I've got some robots out back that can carve these things for you," he would have been on top of that in a New York minute. So, the notion that this is somehow, I don't know, a sharp right turn from the artistic tradition that it purports to embody, absolutely not. I would suggest that it is 100% in the tradition that has existed since the time of antiquity.
So I know my stuff is not going to be picked up by people in Zoom, and so I'll just say I'm familiar with Thomas Eakins and how he uses technology as well. I absolutely agree. My question is, and you can repeat this, what are you looking at for your future projects? Are they going to be inspired by the successes you've had here on the world stage in terms of what you choose to work on next?
So the question is, what are we going to choose to work on next? What kinds of projects? And I have to say that this again is not something that it's part of the story that we always tell, but not a story that necessarily finds its way into the stories that get written. We don't select our projects. We wait for folks to come to us, because I think it's been crucially important to us to have all of our projects be stakeholder led. I mean, I think it's something that we always knew, but it was a point that UNESCO really drove home in those very early meetings in Paris before we ever reconstructed the Palmyra Arch. They said to us in no uncertain terms, "Roger, we can't get behind this project unless it's stakeholder led, unless there are people in Palmyra who want this to be done, who feel like it needs to be done." UNESCO did not realize, because we hadn't talked about it very much for a whole host of reasons, but we had gotten the message loud and clear from the folks in Palmyra that they in fact wanted this project to be done, and it was great advice to receive. Like I say, it was a lesson I think that we already understood, but it was great to have it reinforced, because I'll never forget that on Trafalgar Square, CNN, and you can Google Palmyra Arch CNN today and still watch this exquisite piece of film. The CNN reporter came over to me right after Boris and I finished our speeches and said, "Isn't this cultural appropriation? You're from America. Your crew is from either Italy or from England. Isn't this?" And I said, "Well, look, you got to understand, this is not our project. It's the project of the folks at Palmyra." And there's Dr. Mahmoud Abdul Karim, the Director General of Antiquities and Monuments in Syria, standing right over there next to Mr. Johnson. Go ask him about why we did this project. And I will say, to CNN's credit, they went over, chatted with him, and wrote a story that was 180 degrees different than the story they had come there to report. It was a story in which they captured, I think, all of the intentionality, both on the part of the Syrians and on the part of us at the IDA. So it's a very long-winded way of answering your question, which is to say that, and the same has been true of the Elgin marbles. It was the Greeks that came to us. The same was true of the reconstruction of Westminster Abbey. It was Westminster Abbey that came to us. So our mantra is always to be stakeholder-led, because only then can you have authenticity in the projects. Only then can you sleep at night, sure, in the belief that what you're doing is helping at least someone. And so we're I guess anxiously waiting for the phone to ring with a project to come along that I think is a good match for our skills, but also one that somebody has a strong belief and a credible belief that it needs to be done. And I think there's some folks in Scotland who have an idea in mind. So our next project, I think, is going to take us up to Edinburgh, and it's going to involve a reconstruction of a very famous structure up there, which we will identify in due course.
Thank you. Just like a really quick question, is the goal eventually to bring this to Palmyra?
So we made a promise to the to the folks in Palmyra that originally, I guess I'll use the word, commissioned this project, and to the sons of Dr. Al-Assad, that this monument would be brought to Palmyra once it was safe for us to do it, and once once it could be secure there, and it would stand outside the archaeological museum that Dr. Al-Assad ran. And our fervent hope is that we can get it back there very soon. The notion that it's now 2023 and things don't look any more certain on that front than they did in 2017 is tragic and sad. And so we await with optimism the opportunity to do exactly that. Yes.
Question for Professor Karinowska. So on the website, so it mentioned you have an interest in sort of the olfactory experience of viewing museum documents and manuscripts. Can you speak about sort of the most interesting experience with that? If there's any manuscripts that are particularly memorable?
Yes, please. So the question relates to work we do in the area of olfaction, and poor Dr. Karinowska became very famous for sniffing the Magna Carta, and that image of her sniffing the Magna Carta somehow went viral and ended up on television, print media all around the world. So you're the girl who smelled the Magna Carta. And the question was where we're headed with those. What was the most interesting or most memorable? And I think I know the answer, but I'll let you provide it.
Yeah, I have to say, I mean, sniffing into there are really two questions there. You know, what's the most memorable thing you've sniffed? Which is a question not many people ask you, which is probably, I think the answer there is probably the Magna Carta. But in terms of memorable smells from books, we did an exhibition at the Bodleian last year, I guess, and we captured odors from a collection of books. And then made those available. We sort of recreated the smells and made them available to the public. And I think my favorite of those actually was this incredible Ethiopian gospel that had been sitting on a lectern somewhere in a Catholic church in Ethiopia. And over the centuries, it had soaked up the odor of the incense. And it was an incredible smell. It was really, and quite a challenge actually from the reconstruction point of view. But yeah, that's probably my current favorite.
For me, there's no question. It was the smell of the great stink of 1858. We made a wonderful documentary with a great fellow called Sir Tony Robinson. You may know him from the Black Adder. He was anyway a fascinating and interesting guy.
Baldrick.
He was Baldrick. Yeah. Baldrick, absolutely great guy. And he and I and Dr. Karinowska and a film crew from the BBC went in search of the great stink. We found archaeological evidence on the foreshore of the Thames. We drilled down to the 1858 stratum and we extracted material which still was kept in an anaerobic environment, so still harbored this incredible odor. So the great stink of 1858, things in London had basically come to a head, literally. Too much waste, human waste in the Thames, too much industrial waste in the Thames and in the air of London. And in a hot summer, humid summer's day in 1858, this cloud of gas erupted and hovered over London for a period of weeks, would strike people down in the streets. It was that noxious. But led to a positive outcome, which was the sanitary laws which became global standards in the mid 19th century, emanating from Britain, were a direct result of the Great Stink. We found the Great Stink, brought it back to our laboratory in Oxford, formulated the scent experience of the Great Stink, and Sir Tony came in and smelled that. I'll just tell you very quickly that while we had him in the studio and while we're getting ready to set up the shot for him to actually smell the Great Stink for the first time, the director said, "Hey, is there like another sort of as a starter course, an hors d'oeuvre? Is there another smell you have sort of sitting around that Sir Tony can take in to kind of get his nose ready for the Great Stink?" And I said, "I've got just the thing." And we had extracted the odor of was it a bear? Was it the bear that we did? A bear pit. Yeah, bear pit. So we extracted the odor of a bear from a blanket that a bear was using at a local zoo, and produced a pretty credible bear smell. And we had Sir Tony, without telling him what it was, had him smell it. And I'll never forget, he took in the odor and he made this face, memorable face. He's very expressive, great actor. And he said, "I can't say what that is. I have no idea what that is, but I can tell you," he said, "I feel it inside. I'm scared when I smell it." And I said, whoa, I said, well, Tony, it's the smell of an enormous predator. I said, that's it, you nailed it. It happens to be a bear, and it really was an amazing thing. And I think it really, at some level, great film, great theater, but also it was just a testament to the kind of subtlety that Sir Tony brings to every project. He ran something called Time Team for many years, a program in the UK, which every UK archaeologist cites as one of their formative experiences. The reason they got into archaeology was Sir Tony and Time Team. Here he is, not a trained archaeologist, but knows as much about history and archaeology as anybody, but also just a very subtle and intuitive guy. And it was never more on display than it was that day. So yeah, for me, it's the Great Stink. For you, it's the Magna Carta. Oh no, the Ethiopian Gospels. But I should say, smelling these books is more than just fun. It tells you things about how they're constructed, the history. We had some of Tolkien's books with the pipe tobacco, Tolkien's pipe tobacco infused into it. The Magna Carta spent time in a swamp, or at least this particular Magna Carta did, and there was all of the life of that document came through the odors, and it was an amazing thing. And look, we are people who exist in multiple senses. You walk into the Museum of London, where we will be adding some olfactory experiences when they open their new facility at which Marsh Market is it? Anyway, in Spitalfields in a few years. And but the truth is, you walk in and look at images of 19th century London, and you see all this. You got to understand, when Mark Twain steps off the boat in The Innocents Abroad, the first thing he writes about is the smell of the stench of London. When people were carrying around nosegays, they would have to carry perfume-soaked handkerchiefs next to their nose to navigate the streets of London. Opium dens, flower markets, everything was there. And the smell experience, that was the experience of London. When you see those pictures, you're only getting, it's like the Elgin marbles. You go into the British Museum, you see them denuded of color, decontextualized. You have no idea what it was like to be in 5th century BC Greece, seeing that. That teaches you the opposite of real. And to some degree, by the same token, walking into a museum that shows artifacts from mid-19th century London, you're not getting the full picture. You're getting the picture in one sense, and the smell was really what it was all about. And that's kind of what we hope to bring to some of these exhibitions.
Well, thank you again.
Thank you very much.